Hey everybody, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So thank you so much for joining us for today's Thursday talk. We're so excited that everyone is here, and we're gonna have a very excellent presentation today that we're so excited about. So first, let me introduce myself. I'm Amanda Seal. I am the program manager at Keep Knoxville Beautiful. And we also have Alana McKissick, who is the executive director. She is also here with us today. So before we get started, I want to remind everyone to please keep yourself muted during the talk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the chat because we will have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, let me introduce Michaela Barnett of KnoxFill. She is a lifelong trash aficionado, and Michaela received her bachelor's in sustainability science from Furman University and is currently pursuing her PhD in behavioral science at the University of Virginia. So her research focuses on perceptions of the waste and recycling system, as well as barriers to upstream waste management solutions. So Michaela, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you, Amanda. And thanks for the small and mighty crew that we have here today. I'm glad all of you were able to join. Let me get my presentation loaded up. All righty. Can we all see it? Amanda, I can see you, so I can get a thumbs up. Yes. Great. Wonderful. Okay, so if I do this, are you still seeing the notes? Yes, you are. Great. All righty. All right, thanks for the amazing introduction, Amanda. I'm excited to be here with you all today. So I want to provide a little roadmap of the talk. We're going to start out with the not so great current state of affairs, where we are, and some of the facts about the current state of circularity. But we won't dwell there too long because I take my responsibility as your circularity and sustainability guide this afternoon seriously, and it's not very responsible to leave us feeling depressed when there's actually a lot to be optimistic and hopeful about. So after talking about where we are, we're going to talk about where we can go and the other possible scenarios that we can feel really hopeful about. And then we're going to end up with what you can do in your role in helping this urgent transition to a more sustainable and livable planet. So that we have a shared understanding, I'm just going to give a few definitions. When we talk about the linear economy, this is our current way that we produce most of our goods. So it's often referred to as the take, make, waste model. So we're taking virgin materials out of the ground, we're making products, and then we're throwing them away. We're wasting them. It's represented by a line, because that's all that happens. When we talk about our circular economy, we're really talking about designing out waste in our material streams, designing out pollution, and keeping materials in use. So if our linear economy is the take, make, waste model, a circular economy is a take, make, reuse, make, keep using. We're keeping all of this in circulation. As a sustainability scientist, I sometimes have people ask me why I'm focused so much on waste when climate change is the biggest threat that we are facing as humanity, and why I'm not focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This picture is from a hike last week, and a lot of the plastic water bottles that we picked up in the forest. And the reason I focus so much on waste is because it's interconnected with these other urgent environmental issues. 70% of our greenhouse gas emissions are directly connected to our material use, from mining and resource extraction to transportation, production, and use. So these are very interconnected. When I see something like this plastic water bottle, I think about it in a few different ways. One, that it's a symbol of a much larger problem that's multiplied and expanded. Second, that this is really the end, most salient, tangible kind of object of waste and pollution along this object's entire supply chain. So we have to think about the waste and emissions that are happening in transportation, those that happened when we produced these plastics in a factory and the waste and toxins that occurred there. And then also those that occurred when we took the fossil fuels out of the ground. So if we think about waste, and we're making a decision to throw something away, that represents waste and pollution alongside a much larger system that's not only when waste leaves the system, but when waste enters into the system. To get us grounded in the current state of affairs, I'm going to start with 3 percentages: 8.6%, 70%, and 9%. 8.6% is a number that came from a group that did a study called the Circularity Gap Report back in 2020. And they found that our world is just 8.6% circular. This is a decrease from the year before when we were at 9.1% circular. And what does this mean? This is a really beautiful but kind of intimidating graphic that shows all of the materials that entered the world. This was in 2017, but we have similar material footprints every year. So in 2017, we surpassed a really important mark, which is that 100 billion tons of materials entered our economy. When we're talking about billions, I know that's a really, really hard number for us to grasp. So whenever I think about billions, I like to think about it in something that's a little more tangible, like seconds, which is, a unit of time that we're familiar with. So if we were to think about 100 billion tons of materials entering our global economy, if we were to make 1 ton equal 1 second, 1 ton equals 1 second, then it would take over 3,000 years to get to 100 billion tons. So if we had 1 ton, which is 2,000 pounds of material entering our global economy every second, it would take us over 3,000 years to get the amount of materials that we produced and extracted last year. So of this 100 billion tons, we've got 92 billion tons that are extracted resources and just 8.6 resources that are being circled back in. So that's what we mean when we talk about the world only being 8.6% circular. So it's not a great picture, and there's a lot of opportunities to change as we move forward. 70%. Does anyone want to hazard a guess in the chat as to what this number might represent? I'll give a second or two if anyone wants to hazard a guess. That's a great guess, Amanda. How much of our waste goes to landfill? And it's actually pretty close. That's not what this number represents, but it's a good estimate. Anyone else? Give it a few more seconds. So percent that could be recyclable that isn't, that's also an amazing guess. But but 70% actually comes from a report from 2018 from the World Bank, aptly titled, "What a Waste." And 70%, these scientists estimate that by 2050, we will have a 70% increase in the amount of municipal solid waste that we're generating if we continue on business as usual. So if things are bad now, they're only going to get worse and multiply in the future if we continue on our current linear paths. I'm going to ask you the same for 9% if anyone wants to hazard a guess, and I'll give you a hint. It has to do with plastics. Yes, yes, yes. I know, this is a great statistic. Mary and Alana, this is the percent of plastics that are actually recycled. So in 2017, a group of researchers did a series of calculations and estimates, and they looked at all the plastic that's ever been produced in the world from the 1950s to today. And they found that only 9% of these plastics has ever been recycled, with the rest, so 91%, going to landfills, the natural environment, and being incinerated. So this is the current state of affairs. I want to talk really briefly about recycling because this is something that's been getting a lot of attention in the news lately, and I think it's important in any conversation about more sustainable materials management and circularity. I think there's two dominant narratives. One that we grew up with and that's been around for a long time, which is that recycling is a panacea. It's a cure-all for our waste woes, and it is the most sustainable, pro-environmental, pro-civic behavior that we can have. The other narrative that's really been coming out in the last few years and more recently is on the completely other side of the spectrum. Recycling is a scam. It's a completely broken system that doesn't work at all, that just makes us feel better about our overproduction and overgeneration of waste. And the truth is more complex, and it's more nuanced, and it's hard to talk about these things with nuance when each of these black and whites is a lot more attractive. But the truth about recycling really falls somewhere in the middle. It's part of a strategy towards a sustainable future, but it really is a lesser priority than reducing our waste in the first place. For some materials that are infinitely recyclable, recycling can be a good option for materials like aluminum or other metals. But recycling is still not as good as not producing this waste in the first place, because it's still requiring water and energy to do the recycling. For a product like plastic, recycling is really a much more challenging material, because recycling really acts as deferral, not diversion. What does this mean? For materials like plastics, they can only be recycled once or twice before they downgrade in quality, and they will ultimately need to go to landfills or be incinerated. So for something like plastic, recycling only represents deferral, not diversion from these products ultimately being wasted. For products like plastic too, they require the addition of virgin materials. So recycling is still a better option than if we were to make these shoes out of virgin plastics that come from fossil fuels to make that polyester. So if the recycling is displacing some of that, that's good, but not using it in the first place is better. And if we look at Knoxville's waste and recycling stream, and this graphic is from Patience Melnick, our city's waste and resources manager. So I'm grateful for this. This is how much waste as a city we're producing on a yearly basis. You can see that we are recycling about 9% of our goods. We are composting through leaf and brush, a much higher percentage than national averages. But we're throwing away the majority of our waste, and we're recycling about 9%. Nationally, we're recycling about 25%. So recycling in the current system is really not effectively cycling through many of our goods. We really have to change the way that we are producing, using, and disposing of goods, not just making marginally more sustainable or marginally less wasteful substitutions. And we really have to think differently about waste and change our mental models in our society to consider waste as a system's input, not just a system's output. So something that has the potential to become waste when we purchase it, not just something that we're throwing away when we're at a trash bin or a recycling bin. Recycling is also low-hanging fruit in terms of the individual actions that we can take when we're thinking about, making better choices for the environment. It's really moderately impactful, and there's many other actions we can take. They're going to have a lot bigger bang for our buck. So that's the current state of affairs. But I promised I wouldn't spend too much time dwelling on the negative. And instead, let's transition to where we can go and the things that are bringing me hope in this space if we do change business as usual. So this comes from Yale Climate Change Communication. And this is how this group of scientists talks about climate change, condensing a complex topic to something that's easy to understand. Scientists agree, it's real, it's us, it's bad, but there's hope. And this is how I think about waste and issues of circularity. The facts are there. Our overproduction, overconsumption, and overgeneration of waste is real, and it's us, and it's bad. But there's hope, and we can change it, and we do have the power to create a more sustainable future and present. Something that's making me really hopeful these days is a growing consciousness that I'm seeing among the American public. A broad majority of Americans do support a range of initiatives to reduce the impacts of climate change, and this cuts across partisan lines. So this is Democrats and Republicans united for sustainable initiatives that are going to help us create a better future and present. A vast majority, 65% of the American public, are very or extremely concerned about plastics in the ocean and are reporting hearing about issues of plastic pollution and waste pollution as much as they're hearing about climate change from friends and the media and social networks, showing that this is a problem that we're starting to become aware of, and that's the first step to changing it. This makes me really excited. 80% of Americans said that they would buy products that don't use single-use plastic if provided the option. The will is there, and the system just has to catch up. Something else that's bringing me a lot of hope and optimism is proposed legislation at the federal and at the statewide level. So the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, a bill that's been introduced at the federal level, is probably the most sweeping piece of waste-related legislation that we've seen in this country in the last 50 years. And it, if passed, is going to incentivize circular design, so designing with the end in mind, incentivize refill programs like KnoxFill and the company that I started, require actual recycling, banning certain single-use products, and actually holding companies accountable for the products that they're creating. Right now, most companies are not accountable or responsible for all of the waste that they produce. Instead, it falls upon us as the taxpayers to fund our local municipal waste programs and deal with this overgeneration of single-use plastic products. And so bills like this that fall under the realm of extended producer responsibility legislation help put that responsibility back onto the companies that are generating a lot of this waste. And lastly, new novel models of alternative consumption that people are embracing. This image on the left is of a tool library, which we can think of as a collaborative consumption hub in which, instead of each individual person buying something that they won't use very often, a community pooling resources together to use resources more sustainably and with this community basis in mind. This image on the right is from Algramo. It's a Chilean-based startup that's appearing in other places, and I think also in parts of the US, that dispenses household goods in bulk, so you're getting what you need without plastic packaging, which is similar to KnoxFill's model. So people are embracing alternative and reduced forms of consumption. That makes me feel really encouraged that we can start to do this at scale. So I'd love for you all to think about what brings you hope for sustainability and circularity, because I really think that within community and collective action is how we maintain and inspire motivation around these. And if we have time at the end during the Q&A, I'd love to share those and read through those. So what can you specifically do as an individual to help promote this necessary and urgent transition? Part of it's a mentality shift. So for a really long time, I felt like I was responsible for all of the problems that we were seeing with climate and waste, and that I was responsible for fixing it. And that made me feel a lot of guilt and anxiety, and it was very overwhelming and paralyzing. Then I really shift that perspective, and I stopped feeling guilty and anxious, and I started feeling really angry at the big plastic polluters and the big emitters. And I started feeling like this problem wasn't my fault at all. It was actually the problem of the big corporations and the system. So I really had this mindset in the past. It's all my fault and I have to do everything. That then shifted to none of it's my fault and I can't really do anything. What can one person do when we look at this huge amount of terrible impact that these big corporations are having? And now I've really shifted to a middle ground, which is that the collective helps us connect this individual and this systems form of action. And it's finding a middle ground in these narratives. So it's not all my fault, and it's not my fault at all. Some of it is because of me, and I can do something. But together, we can do a lot more. So I want to talk a little bit about this power of the collective and what happens when we all act, because our individual actions, when multiplied, do have an impact. So I launched KnoxFill, which is a zero waste refillery in Knoxville, about 5 months ago, 4.5 months ago. And in that time, we've helped transition over 400 households away from one or more disposable single-use item to more sustainable low waste swaps. So this is 400 households on the road to zero waste. And we've prevented 1,200 single-use containers from ever going to the landfill and from ever having to be created in the first place. But if we really scale up and start thinking about this, so I think the 2020 census results came out earlier this month, or not too long ago, and it has Knoxville's most recent population at 190,000. Small city. But if just 10% of our households cut our waste in half, we could keep almost 17,000 pounds of waste from being generated. And that's the power of the collective and the power if we all work together. Now, cutting half of our waste, that's a lot. You know, my family and household's not zero waste. We're pretty low waste. So cutting half your waste might be a lot. We could get to the same number if 20% of Knoxville's residents cut their waste by just a quarter. So these small changes in the aggregate can really be multiplied when we act as a collective. There's a lot of triangles out there when we talk about sustainability actions. You've got the hierarchy of needs, you've got a hierarchy of waste, and they rank these from most effective to least effective. And I think these can be useful tools, but they can also make us think in a binary. As individuals, we're part of multiple scales and multiple groups. We're individuals, we're part of our communities, and we're part of the collective. And we can promote change if we act at each one of these scales and we move between these groups. So we have to move away from these binary ways of thinking. So it is impactful if you work to go zero waste or you transition your household to low waste. Might not be the most impactful thing we can do, but in the collective, it will have a measurable impact. Something else we can do is join a like-minded community, because that's where we maintain our motivation, we're held accountable, we come up with new ideas, and we form new collaborative ways of consuming and using resources. But we also have to change the system. I think it's a little unfair. We are not the ones that caused this problem. And as much as I want to put the onus completely on companies, they are not going to change unless they are made to, because the current way of producing and selling goods fits their bottom line. So they aren't going to change unless we make them. And we have to be the ones leading the change because we're aware of this problem. So the way that we can help change the system so that these less wasteful ways of being in the world are the default is by voting. It's by calling our representatives to change the system and hold these big polluters accountable so that we can change the system at scale and make living more sustainably easier for everyone, and so that we can live in line with our values and the limits of our planetary system. That's really why I created KnoxFill. I'm just going to spend a few minutes chatting about this company. You know, KnoxFill is at the local scale, and it came out of the desire to solve these problems and also be a mini producer that was taking responsibility for waste. So KnoxFill works like the milkman. It provides personal care and household goods and refillable, reusable containers that get swapped out when they're empty. It's circularity at a local scale, which is really what we need. While I want these big companies to start embracing refill models and start embracing less wasteful, more sustainable ways of operating, we also need these in communities across the country. My mission through KnoxFill is to radically change the way that we produce, consume, and dispose of goods, to make sustainable options more accessible, and to reduce the guilt and anxiety and complexity around sustainable living. And lastly, I really want to help support and create this community for sustainability that we have here. I have been blown away by the hunger and the enthusiasm for alternatives. And I know that Knoxville has so many nicknames. I don't think I've ever lived in a city with more nicknames. We are the Maker City, we're the Marble City, we're the Scruffy City. But I really think we should and can add one more nickname to our community, and that's the Circular City, or some variation thereof. I think we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. Here is my contact info through the store and the social pages. And I'm really glad we all got to be here together today. So I will turn it back over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Michaela. That was so fascinating. And I know I certainly have a few questions for you. If anyone else has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat box. So I'll go ahead and I'll kick it off, and then we can move to any other questions we have. So with KnoxFill specifically, I'm very curious to know, what aspect of people's lives do you see them most willing to make change in? What seems to be the first step people are most willing to take, whether it's with their cleaning products or shampoo and conditioner, oral care, different things like that? Like, what do you see as the first step for many people in switching to this, these more circular practices?
That's a great question. And I think it really depends on the person. I have had some people switch their entire household over once KnoxFill came into being. And as soon as they ran out of their product, they switched it over to KnoxFill's product. And I've had some people start with some of the easier ones like hand soap and laundry detergent to get a feel for these new products. Something else that's been really helpful has been offering samples. We are brand loyal. We know what products work for us. We're adults. We've figured it out. I've shared this story a few times now. But when I was in college, I tried to do everything with a combination of baking soda, Castile soap, and vinegar, like including washing my hair, brushing my teeth. It was a disaster. It was sustainable, but I felt terrible. And so something I've been really intentional about is making sure that our products aren't only not wasteful and really good for planet and for people, but they also perform really well and they're just awesome products. So we offer sample options if people are hesitant and want to try them out before they make the full scale shift. So I'd say it really, really depends on the person.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That makes sense. So we had a question from Leon in the comments, or in the chat box, said, would you say it is responsible to address the problem of downstream? Some argue that just incentivizes heavy polluters to keep polluting since it can always be cleaned up.
I mean, yes, we have to do both. It's a both and, not an either or. Something that I sometimes get frustrated by is recycled content mandates, for example, which can be a good solution, right? If we say, hey, of your products, 50% of them have to be recycled. But like what you're saying, Leon, is what that does is that incentivizes more production of things to then be recycled. So that's not helping reduce waste at the source necessarily, but it's incentivizing increased consumption. There's this analogy that gets used a lot in this space, which is that our current models of tackling plastic pollution is like we've got an overflowing bathtub, and instead of turning off the tap, we're just furiously mopping the bathroom while it continues to overflow. We have to do both. We have to turn off the tap, and then we have to mop up the mess that we've made. So I think it's a both and I think hopefully good legislation can keep those polluters from polluting, even while we clean up the natural environments that they're causing a lot of destruction in.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary. She says, thinking about the 9% statistics, would you please talk more about the current state of plastic recycling in this country, given the context of our struggling export partnership with China? As I take my plastics to a drop-off recycling site, I always wonder if it is hauled straight to the landfill anyways, in lieu of actually being recycled. Where can we as consumers and citizens get honest answers about that? Because I don't think I'm getting a straight answer, even when I feel I'm going straight to the source.
Totally. Yes, this is a wonderful question too. So current state of plastic recycling in this country, like most recycling, is a little bit complicated. So in 2018, China passed the National Sword Act, which limited what the recyclables that they would accept to having less than 0.5% worth of contamination. So prior to that, we were sending about 40% of our recyclables to China, and we had very high contamination rates, and then leaving them to sort it, deal with it. A lot of it wasn't getting recycled. I think that happening has been really positive in a lot of ways because it pulled the curtain back and made us internalize a lot of the waste problems that we had been externalizing. So there's 7 different types of plastic. Almost all of them will have the recyclable sign on them. In the United States, typically the only plastics that are actually getting recycled are types 1, 2, and 5. Some specialty recyclers will do things with others. In Knoxville, we are lucky to have some pretty robust recycling markets regionally. So some of our plastics will be going to do things like making carpet, for example. So that's something that's going to last for a few decades before it ultimately goes to landfill. Something like plastic bag recycling, if you take it to a grocery store, that is going to be made into plastic decking. So some of these things are actually being recycled. The other kind of complex part of this puzzle is that in Knoxville, we have some pretty good waste sorting technology. So some of the plastics that you're putting through the waste stream, even if they're not recyclable with current markets now, they could be in the future. And our sorting systems will be able to identify some of those and sort it appropriately. So it's complicated. Some of our plastics are getting recycled. A lot of them aren't because of contamination. And it's true that, you know, we aren't exporting to China anymore, but we are exporting to a lot of other Southeast Asian countries that have stepped up to meet that demand and that are taking our recyclables. Whether or not those are then getting recycled in, you know, actual manageable ways, or if they're just promoting a lot of pollution in the countries they're going to, is a little bit of an open question, but it's really negatively impacting those communities. So some of it's getting recycled, some of it is going to landfill if it doesn't meet those standards. It is a commodity-based process. I hope that answered that question. Can talk about these things a long time.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting because it's like what you were saying about the deferral of the plastics of, you know, it's so easy, I think, if you had like a plastic water bottle to be like, well, it's fine to use this because I'll just recycle it, but it will eventually end up in a landfill or being incinerated, even if it is recycled once or twice, because at a certain point it is no longer useful. So I think that's such an interesting point about making sure we are cutting it off at the source and being intentional about what we're buying, and, you know, looking at a product before you buy it and being like, how much of this will I actually have to recycle?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the plastics industry are really pushing for chemical recycling now. So breaking these plastics down and the bid that they can be more infinitely recycled. And then some of them really point to waste to energy, as some of them are calling that a form of recycling, which it's not, right? It's burning plastics to capture some of that energy. So these are really lesser preferred solutions to just not doing it in the first place. And what you were saying, Amanda, we have empirical evidence from research that having the option to recycle causes people to increase their resource consumption. So if we think that we have a sustainable way to throw something away, we're going to consume a lot more of that resource than if we don't have those options.
No, that is true, because I think about the amount of plastic I would not buy if I was not able to recycle it. So I definitely could see how that is true. So if we have any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we'll be wrapping things up soon. I'll ask one last question just while we wait to see if we do have any final ones. But we had talked briefly, we were talking briefly before the presentation started, Michaela, about your PhD, because you were telling me how it connects so much with KnoxFill and what you're doing. And I would love for you to just share a little bit with everyone about that, because it sounded so fascinating. So.
Yeah, absolutely. So before I kind of talk about my dissertation specifically, I'm going to go back to what you just said, which is if I didn't have the option to recycle, I'd probably buy a lot less plastic. So some of the research that I've done right now looks at, whether or not we have a recycling bias and a disposal default. And one of the questions that I asked my survey participants was, if recycling were taken away in your community, how would you change your behaviors? And I was really hoping to prompt, source reduction behaviors, or get people to say, like, I would buy less of the things that I recycle. The number one response I got from a representative sample was people saying, I would drive my recyclables to another place that still recycles. I would hoard them and I would drive them. And that just blew me away. And that's a good representation of my research. So I look at people's perceptions of the current waste system and the recycling and disposal biases they have. And in the next stage of my research for my dissertation, I'll be looking at strategies to overcome those biases and help people think about source reduction strategies and really look at barriers and facilitators to participating in the refill economy. So how we can get more people to use models like KnoxFill so that this can be a viable alternative that we can scale across the nation and then across the world.
No, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and a special thank you to Michaela for your presentation. It has been so fascinating. I really enjoyed it. So I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as well. And thank you all for being here today.
Thank you all. I really enjoyed it. I'm going to read Mary's comment before we head off.
That's fine.
And Mary says, things that give me hope and encouragement are organizations like Keep Knoxville Beautiful and Knoxville. Thank you for that. Keep up the great work. Mary, thank you for those kind words. I agree. I was sharing this with someone right before we got on the call today, that starting Knoxville has made me more hopeful and optimistic about our environment and our community than anything else has for a long time. And the person was like, oh, that's good to hear. You used to go on these rants about the state of the world. And it's like, well, those are still true, but I'm grateful for the hope and optimism that this community brings me every day.
Oh, that's such a lovely thing to hear. It is nice to know that there is hope. Well, thank you all so much. Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.